The year is 880 AD. A Viking longship cuts through the Dnieper River, its crew speaking Old Norse. They're 2,000 kilometers from the Baltic Sea, deep in territory no Scandinavian had seen a generation before. Ahead lie 7 cataracts, violent rapids where they'll drag the ship overland while nomadic raiders watch from the hills. Behind them, furs and amber. Ahead, the riches of Constantinople. This wasn't exploration, this was business. And the route these Northmen carved through Eastern Europe's rivers would become the blueprint for an empire that lasted 400 years. But how did Scandinavian traders become the founders of Russia? The invitation that changed history. 862 AD. The lands around Lake Ladoga are at war. Slavic tribes, the Krivichi, the Ilmen Slovenes, fight Finnish tribes. Everyone fights each other. There's no central authority, no law, just endless cycles of revenge and tribute extraction. Trade suffers. Settlements burn. The chaos is unsustainable. According to the Primary Chronicle, compiled 250 years later by monks in Kiev, the tribes made a decision that changed history. They sent messengers across the Baltic to the Varangians, Norse traders and warriors who'd been raiding and trading along these routes for decades. The invitation was direct. Our land is great and rich, but there is no order in it. Come to rule and reign over us. The Varangian who answered was named Rurik. He arrived with his brothers Cineas and Truva and a fleet of warriors. Rurik took Ladoga, the key trading post where the Volkhov River meets Lake Ladoga. Cineas took Beluzero to the east. Truvor took Izborsk to the west. Within 2 years, both brothers were dead. Disease, battle, the chronicles don't say. Rurik absorbed their territories and moved south to establish a new settlement, Novgorod, the new town. From there, he controlled the northern end of the river trade routes. This is the founding myth of Russia. But is it true? The anti-Normanist debate has raged for 200 years. Normanists argue the Vikings founded Kiev and Rus. Anti-Normanists claim Rurik was either a myth or a minor mercenary hired by Slavic elites who were already building a state. The debate became political in the 19th century. Russian nationalists couldn't accept that their state was founded by foreigners. But the evidence is overwhelming. Archaeological digs at Staraya Ladoga reveal Scandinavian-style buildings, Norse metalwork, and burial practices distinct from Slavic traditions. Genetic studies show Scandinavian ancestry in early Rus's elite graves. Linguistically, the word Rus itself likely derives from Old Norse rodsmen, rowers, or from the Finnish word ruotsi, meaning Swedes. Byzantine sources from the 9th century describe the Rus as a people distinct from the Slavs, with Scandinavian names, Helgi, Ingvar, Rönnvalder. The Primary Chronicle lists the early Rus's rulers and their retinues. The names are Norse, not Slavic: Rurik, Oleg, Igorga. These aren't Slavic names, they're Old Norse names that were later Slavicized. But here's what the anti-Normanists get right. The Varangians didn't conquer a vacuum. Slavic agricultural societies already existed. Finnic tribes controlled trade networks. What Rurik and his warriors provided was military organization and access to Scandinavian trade networks. They didn't create civilization, they created a state. The hybrid was immediate. Varangian warriors married Slavic women. They adopted Slavic language for administration because the local population spoke it. They learned the river routes from Finnish guides. Within 2 generations, the distinction between Varangian and Slav was blurring. Rurik ruled until 879. When he died, he left behind a young son, Igor, and a state that controlled the northern rivers. But the real prize lay 900 kilometers south, where the Dnieper River bends toward the Black Sea. The city was called Kiev. and the man who would seize it was Rurik's kinsman, Oleg. Oleg's masterstroke, birth of Kievan Rus. 879 AD, Rurik is dead. His son Igor is a child, maybe 5 years old. Power passes to Oleg, Rurik's kinsman, possibly a brother-in-law, possibly a military commander. The chronicles call him regent. In practice, he was ruler. Oleg understood something Rurik hadn't fully grasped. Novgorod controlled the northern rivers, but Kiev controlled the Dnieper. And the Dnieper was the highway to Byzantium. Whoever held Kiev held the entire north-south trade route. Novgorod collected furs and amber from the Baltic. Kiev sat at the gateway to the Black Sea and Constantinople, the richest city in Europe. Kiev was ruled by two Varangian warlords, Askold and Dir. They'd seized the city years earlier, possibly during Rurik's lifetime. They raided Byzantine territory, launched a naval assault on Constantinople in 860, and extracted tribute from local Slavic tribes. They were rivals, not subordinates. Oleg decided to remove them. 882 AD. Oleg sails south from Novgorod with a fleet and an army. He brings the child Igor with him. The chronicles say Oleg disguised his forces as a merchant convoy, hiding warriors below deck. When he reached Kiev, he sent word to Askold and Dir that fellow Varangian traders had arrived and wanted to meet. Askold and Dir came to the riverbank. Oleg's men surrounded them. Oleg stepped forward, holding young Igor. "You are not of princely blood," he reportedly said, "but this boy is the son of Rurik." Then he had them killed. Kiev was his. Oleg's declaration became the founding statement of Kievan Rus. Let Kiev be the mother of Rus's cities. It wasn't poetry, it was strategy. By seizing Kiev, Oleg unified the northern and southern trade routes under one ruler. Novgorod controlled the Baltic access. Kiev controlled the Dnieper and the route to Byzantium. For the first time, a single political entity controlled the entire river highway from Scandinavia to the Black Sea. This was state formation through geography. Over the next 2 decades, Oleg expanded his control. He defeated the Khazars, a Turkic people who had dominated the southern steppes and extracted tribute from Slavic tribes. He brought the Severians and Radimichs under his rule, not by conquest alone, but by offering protection and lower tribute rates than the Khazars had demanded. He fortified the trade route, building settlements at key points: Smolensk, Lubeck, Chernigov. The Varangian elite provided military force. The Slavic majority provided agricultural surplus and manpower. The system worked because it was symbiotic. The Northmen needed local knowledge, local labor, and local legitimacy. The Slavs needed protection from steppe nomads and access to lucrative trade networks. By 907 AD, Oleg felt strong enough to challenge Byzantium directly. He launched a naval expedition, 2,000 ships according to the chronicles, though that number is likely exaggerated. The fleet sailed down the Dnieper across the Black Sea and attacked Constantinople. Byzantine sources confirm a Rus's raid that year. The Emperor Leo VI, caught off guard, negotiated. The result was the Treaty of 911, one of the first diplomatic agreements between Kievan Rus' and the Byzantine Empire. The treaty granted Rus's merchants the right to trade in Constantinople, tax-free, for up to 6 months. It established legal protections for Rus's traders and outlined terms for mutual defense. Byzantium recognized Kievan Rus as a legitimate power. Oleg returned to Kiev in triumph. He ruled until 912, when he died, bitten by a snake according to legend, fulfilling a prophecy. But his legacy was concrete. He had taken 2 separate Varangian outposts and forged them into a single state. He had secured the trade route that would fund Kievan Rus for the next 200 years. He had forced Byzantium to recognize the Russes as equals. Kiev was now the center of a new civilization, and the question was no longer whether the Northmen could hold territory in the east. The question was what kind of state they would build. The route from the Varangians to the Greeks. The wealth of Kievan Russes flowed along a single artery, a 3,000-kilometer water highway connecting the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea. The Byzantines called it the route from the Varangians to the Greeks. For the Rus, it was survival. The journey began in Scandinavia. Varangian traders loaded longships with amber from the Baltic coast, furs from the northern forests, marten, sable, fox, and slaves captured in raids or bought from Slavic middlemen. They sailed across the Baltic to the Gulf of Finland, up the Dnieper River into Lake Ladoga, then south along the Volkhov River to Novgorod. From Novgorod, the route continued south through Lake Ilmen, up the Lovat River. Then came the first portage. The ships had to be dragged overland, sometimes several kilometers, to reach the headwaters of the Dnieper. This wasn't a quick process. A fully loaded longship weighed several tons. Crews used logs as rollers, ropes, and brute strength. The portages were vulnerable points. Nomadic raiders knew where the Russes had to slow down. Once on the Dnieper, the route followed the river south through the heartland of what would become Kievan Rus. The ships passed Smolensk, where tribute was collected from the Krivichi. They passed Kiev, where Oleg had built his capital. Then came the most dangerous section, the Dnieper Rapids. 7 cataracts blocked the river between modern-day Dnipro and Zaporizhzhia in Ukraine. Byzantine Emperor Constantine VII Porphyrogenitus described them in the 10th century, recording both their Slavic and Norse names. The 4th cataract, called Ifor in Norse and Neosit in Slavic, was the worst. The water crashed over rocks in a deafening roar. Ships couldn't pass through. The Russes had 2 options. Smaller boats could be unloaded and dragged along the shore. Larger ships had to be carried, lifted entirely out of the water, and hauled overland for up to 6 kilometers. Meanwhile, the cargo was transported separately. Some men carried, others stood guard. This was where the Pechenegs attacked. The Pechenegs were Turkic nomads who controlled the steppes south of Kiev. They knew the Rus were most vulnerable at the rapids. They waited in the hills, watching for merchant convoys. When the Rus were committed to the portage, ships out of the water, men scattered between cargo and defense, the Pechenegs struck. Constantine VII wrote that the Russes posted sentries on the cliffs above the rapids. Even so, losses were common. Entire expeditions were wiped out. The survivors who made it past the 7th cataract stopped at an island in the river, Khortytsia, to rest and give thanks to their gods. They sacrificed roosters, drawing lots to determine whether the birds would be eaten or released alive as offerings. From the rapids, the Dnieper opened into a broad, navigable river flowing south to the Black Sea. The Russes followed the western shore to the mouth of the Dnieper, then turned west along the coast to the Byzantine frontier. The final stretch took them to Constantinople, Miklagard in Old Norse, Zagrad in Slavic, the city of gold. There, Rus merchants sold furs, slaves, honey and wax. They bought silk, spices, wine and silver. The profits were enormous. A single successful journey could make a trader wealthy, but the risks were equally high. Disease, shipwreck, nomadic raids, Byzantine tariffs. Every stage of the journey held danger. This route wasn't just commerce. It was the circulatory system of Kievan Russes. The trade funded Oleg's armies, built Kiev's fortifications, and paid tribute to keep the Pechenegs at bay. The route connected Scandinavia to Byzantium, pagan north to Christian south, barbarian frontier to imperial civilization. And every journey brought more than goods. It brought ideas, faith, and ambition. Igor's greed and Olga's revenge. 945 AD, Igor, son of Rurik, ruled from Kiev. He was in his 60s, a veteran of decades of tribute collection and border wars. Every autumn, the Grand Prince of Kiev led his retinue on Polyudi, the circuit, traveling through subject territories to collect tribute: furs, honey, wax, slaves. The tribute funded the state, paid the warriors, and kept the trade routes open. The Derevlians, a Slavic tribe living in the forests west of Kiev, paid their tribute. Igor's men loaded the goods and departed. Then Igor made a decision that would kill him. He turned back. He wanted more. The Primary Chronicle records what happened next. The Derevlians saw Igor's smaller force returning and understood what it meant. This wasn't tribute collection, this was extortion. Their prince, Mal, called a council. If a wolf comes among the sheep and takes one, he will take the whole flock unless he is killed. They ambushed Igor's retinue in the forest. The chronicles describe his execution with brutal precision. The Derevlians bent 2 birch trees down to the ground, tied Igor between them, and released the trees. His body was torn apart. Igor's widow was named Olga. She became regent for their young son, Sviatoslav. She was a Varangian, possibly from Pskov, and she understood power. The Derevlians had killed a grand prince. If she didn't respond with overwhelming force, every subject tribe would see weakness. Tribute would stop, the state would fracture. But Olga didn't just want revenge. She wanted a lesson that would echo for generations. The Derevlians sent a delegation to Kiev, 20 men in a boat, with a proposal. Prince Mal wanted to marry Olga and rule Kiev himself. Olga received them with courtesy. She told them she was honored by the proposal and asked them to return the next day. "I will send men to carry you in your boat to my palace, as befits your status." The next morning, Olga's men dug a deep pit in the courtyard. When the Derevlian delegation arrived, still seated in their boat, Olga's warriors lifted the boat with the men inside and threw it into the pit. They buried them alive. Olga stood at the edge and asked if they found the honor to their taste. The chronicles record no answer. Olga sent word to the Derevlians, "Send me your best men, so I may come to your prince with proper honor." The Derevlians, unaware of the first delegation's fate, sent their leading citizens. When they arrived in Kiev, Olga offered them a bathhouse to wash after their journey. Once they were inside, her men barred the doors and set the building on fire. They burned alive. Then Olga traveled to Derevlian territory, claiming she wanted to hold a funeral feast at Igor's grave. The Derevlians prepared a banquet. Olga's retinue arrived. She ordered her men to serve the Derevlians drink after drink. When 5,000 Derevlians were drunk and incapacitated, Olga gave the signal. Her warriors massacred them. The following year, Olga besieged Iskorostan, the Derevlian capital. The siege dragged on. Finally, Olga sent a message. She would lift the siege if the Derevlians paid a token tribute, 3 pigeons and 3 sparrows from each household. The Derevlians, desperate and exhausted, agreed. Olga's men tied pieces of sulfur wrapped in cloth to the birds' legs and released them at night. The birds flew back to their nests in the thatched roofs of Iskorostan. The city burned. Those who fled the flames were captured or killed. Olga took the survivors as slaves and imposed a heavy tribute on the remaining Derevlian lands. The message was clear: kill a grand prince and the response will be total. But Olga's legacy wasn't violence, it was what came next, the grandmother who saw the future. 957 AD, Olga traveled to Constantinople. She was nearly 70 years old, a widow who had ruled Kievan Rus' for 12 years as regent for her son Sviatoslav. She came with a large retinue, merchants, warriors, priests, and a request that shocked the Byzantine court. She wanted to be baptized as a Christian. The Byzantine Emperor Constantine VII Porphyrogenitus received her with full ceremony. Olga was baptized in Hagia Sophia, the greatest church in Christendom. She took the baptismal name Helena, after Saint Helena, mother of Constantine, the emperor who had made Christianity the religion of Rome. The symbolism was deliberate. Constantine VII himself served as her godfather. According to Byzantine sources, the emperor was captivated by Olga's intelligence and presence. He proposed marriage. Olga's response revealed the political mind that had destroyed the Derevlians. "How can you marry me?" she asked. "You are now my godfather. In Christian law, that makes marriage between us incest." Constantine had been outmaneuvered. He gave her gifts, gold, silk, sacred relics, and sent her home. Olga returned to Kiev as the first Christian ruler of Rus. But conversion at the top didn't mean conversion of the state. Her son Sviatoslav refused baptism. He was a warrior, a pagan who worshipped Perun, the Slavic god of thunder and war. When Olga pressed him to convert, he reportedly laughed. "How can I accept a foreign faith? My retinue will mock me." For Sviatoslav, Christianity was weakness. His men were warriors who raided, conquered, and took what they wanted. They didn't kneel to a god who preached mercy. Olga didn't force the issue. She understood that power in Kiev rested on military strength, and Sviatoslav commanded the loyalty of the Druzhina, the prince's retinue of professional warriors. Forcing Christianity on them would trigger rebellion. Instead, Olga built churches. She allowed Christian priests to operate freely in Kiev. She created space for the faith to exist alongside paganism. Slowly, a Christian community took root in the capital. Merchants who traded with Byzantium, Slavic converts, Varangian warriors who had seen the wealth and power of Constantinople and understood that Christianity was the religion of civilization. Most importantly, Olga raised her grandson Vladimir in a household where Christianity was present. She didn't baptize him. That would have provoked Sviatoslav, but she exposed him to the faith, to the priests, to the idea that there was an alternative to the pagan gods of the north. Olga died in 969, still a Christian in a pagan state. The Primary Chronicle calls her the dawn before the sun, the morning star before the light. She didn't convert Kievan Rus, but she planted the seed. Her son Sviatoslav had other plans. He wasn't interested in faith or diplomacy. He wanted conquest, and for 8 years he waged war across Eastern Europe with a ferocity that terrified Byzantium and destroyed the Khazar Khaganate forever. But his ambition would kill him. Sviatoslav, the pagan warrior. 964 AD. Sviatoslav took power in his own right. He was in his early 20s, a warrior who had grown up in his mother's shadow. Now Olga was old, her influence fading. Sviatoslav wanted to prove himself, and he had no interest in administering tribute or managing trade routes. He wanted conquest. The Primary Chronicle describes him with unusual detail. He was lean, wore a single earring, and shaved his head except for a lock of hair on one side, a Turkic fashion adopted from the steppe nomads he fought. He traveled light, carrying no tents or kettles. He slept on the ground with a saddle for a pillow. He ate horse meat roasted over a fire. Before attacking, he sent messengers ahead with a simple declaration: "I am coming against you." His first target was the Volga Bulgars, a Turkic people who controlled the middle Volga River and the eastern trade routes. Sviatoslav's army sailed up the Volga, defeated the Bulgars, and sacked their capital. Then he turned south toward the Khazars. The Khazar Khaganate had dominated the southern steppes for 300 years. They were a Turkic semi-nomadic empire whose ruling elite had converted to Judaism in the 8th century. They controlled the trade routes between the Caspian Sea and the Black Sea, extracting tribute from Slavic tribes and taxing merchants traveling between Byzantium and Central Asia. They were the reason Oleg had been able to expand Kiev's power. By the time Oleg arrived, Khazar control was already weakening. Sviatoslav shattered what remained. In 965, he led his army across the steppe, defeated Khazar forces in the field, and captured their capital, Atil, at the mouth of the Volga River on the Caspian Sea. He burned it. The Khazar state collapsed. Their khaganate never recovered. Sviatoslav's campaign opened the eastern steppes to Rus's influence and eliminated the power that had once controlled the region, but it also created a vacuum. Without the Khazars to hold them back, Pecheneg and Turkic tribes moved west, raiding closer to Kiev's borders. Sviatoslav had won a military victory that created a strategic problem for his successors. But he wasn't finished. In 967, Byzantine Emperor Nikephoros II Phocas hired Sviatoslav to attack the Bulgarians in the Balkans. Byzantium wanted to weaken Bulgaria, a rival Christian state on its northern border. Sviatoslav invaded with 60,000 men, conquered 80 Bulgarian towns, and established his base at Pereyaslawets on the Danube. Then he decided to stay. "I do not care to remain in Kiev," he reportedly told his mother. "I prefer to live in Pereyaslawets on the Danube, for that is the center of my realm. All riches flow there, gold, silks, wine and fruit from Byzantium, silver and horses from Bohemia and Hungary, furs, wax, honey, and slaves from Rus." Sviatoslav saw the Danube as the future center of his empire. Kiev was a backwater compared to the Balkans, closer to Byzantium, closer to the wealth of the Mediterranean. He wanted to move the capital. Byzantium turned on him. Emperor John I Tzimiskes, who had overthrown Nikephoros, now viewed Sviatoslav as a threat. In 971, a Byzantine army marched north into Bulgaria. Sviatoslav's forces fought a series of desperate battles, but were outnumbered and outmaneuvered. At the fortress of Dorostolon, the Byzantines besieged Sviatoslav's army. After months of fighting, Sviatoslav negotiated a retreat. He returned north with a fraction of his original force. In 972, as he approached the Dnieper rapids, Pecheneg nomads ambushed him. Sviatoslav was killed. According to the chronicles, the Pecheneg Khan Kuria made a drinking cup from his skull, rimming it with gold. Sviatoslav's reign was 8 years of constant warfare. He destroyed the Khazars, conquered Bulgaria, and challenged Byzantium. But he left Kiev vulnerable, the treasury depleted, and his sons at war with each other. The state he inherited from his mother was stable. The state he left behind was in chaos. The fratricidal wars. Sviatoslav left 3 sons. Yaropolk ruled Kiev. Oleg controlled the Derevlian lands west of the capital. Vladimir governed Novgorod in the north. For 5 years an uneasy peace held. Then Yaropolk moved. 977 AD, Yaropolk's forces marched into Oleg's territory. The chronicles don't record the pretext, a border dispute, a refused tribute, a personal insult. What mattered was the outcome. The armies met in battle. Oleg's forces broke. He fled toward the town of Vruchi. At the gates, panic spread. Men pushed forward, trampling each other. Oleg fell from his horse into a ravine. Bodies piled on top of him. By the time Yaropolk's men searched the dead, Oleg had suffocated under the weight of corpses. Yaropolk wept when they brought him the body. "I didn't want this," he reportedly said. But he took Oleg's lands anyway. Vladimir saw what was coming. He was the youngest, maybe 18 years old, ruling Novgorod with a Varangian retinue. His mother, Malusha, had been a slave, a housekeeper in Olga's household. That made Vladimir illegitimate in the eyes of Kiev's elite. Yaropolk controlled the heartland. Vladimir controlled the north, but he knew he couldn't hold it if Yaropolk decided to march. So Vladimir ran. He fled across the Baltic to Scandinavia and spent 2 years recruiting. He promised land, plunder, and power to any Varangian warrior willing to follow him back to Russia. He assembled an army, how large the chronicles don't say, but large enough. 980 AD, Vladimir returned. His first target wasn't Kiev. It was Polotsk, a city on the western Dnieper River, ruled by a Varangian prince named Rogvolod. Vladimir sent messengers asking for the hand of Rogvolod's daughter, Rogneda. She refused. "I will not marry the son of a slave," she reportedly said. She was already promised to Yaropolk. Vladimir's response was brutal. He besieged Polotsk, stormed the city, and forced Rogneda to watch as his men killed her father and brothers. Then he married her anyway. The message was clear: insult Vladimir, and he would destroy everything you loved. With Polotsk secured and his northern flank protected, Vladimir marched on Kiev. Yaropolk's support was weaker than it appeared. 2 of his commanders, Varangians named Blud and Varyazhko, had grown disillusioned. Blud opened secret negotiations with Vladimir. When Vladimir's army approached Kiev, Blud convinced Yaropolk to abandon the city and retreat to the fortified town of Rodnya. Yaropolk was trapped. His forces were isolated. His supplies were limited. Blud sent word to Vladimir, "I will deliver your brother to you." He told Yaropolk that Vladimir wanted to negotiate, that safe passage was guaranteed. Yaropolk, desperate and out of options, believed him. When Yaropolk entered the hall where Vladimir waited, 2 Varangian warriors stepped from the shadows. They drove swords under his arms, through his ribs. Yaropolk died on the floor of a room that should have been neutral ground. Vladimir became Grand Prince of Kiev at 20 years old. He had murdered one brother and driven another to death. He had forced a princess into marriage after slaughtering her family. He had betrayed and been betrayed. This was how power transferred in Kievan Rus, not through law or inheritance, but through violence. And Vladimir wasn't finished. He was a pagan zealot, more devoted to the old gods than even his father had been. On a hill overlooking Kiev, he erected idols to the Slavic pantheon: Perun, with his silver head and gold mustache; Dazbog, the sun god; Stribog, the wind god; Mokosh, the earth goddess. He performed sacrifices, animals at first, then humans. The chronicles record that a Christian Varangian and his son were selected by lot for sacrifice. They refused. Vladimir's priests tore down their house and killed them both. For 8 years, Vladimir ruled as a pagan warlord. Then something happened that changed everything. The baptism of Rus. 987 AD. Byzantine Empire faced a crisis. Bardas Phocas, a general from one of Byzantium's most powerful families, had declared himself emperor. He controlled much of Anatolia and was marching on Constantinople. The legitimate emperors, Basil II and his brother Constantine VIII, were desperate. Their own troops were unreliable. They needed soldiers who had no loyalty to Byzantine aristocratic factions. They turned to Vladimir. The proposal was straightforward. Vladimir would send 6,000 Varangian warriors to crush the rebellion. In exchange, Byzantium would send Princess Anna, sister of the emperors, to marry Vladimir. This was unprecedented. Byzantine princesses didn't marry barbarian rulers. They married other emperors, carefully selected allies, men who already ruled Christian kingdoms. Sending a porphyrogenitor, a princess born in the purple chamber of the imperial palace, to a pagan warlord in Kiev was a humiliation. But Basil II had no choice. He agreed with one condition: Vladimir had to convert to Christianity. Vladimir accepted. The Varangian army sailed south. They landed in Anatolia and crushed Bardas Phocas's forces at the Battle of Abydos In 989, the rebellion collapsed. Basil II was secure, but when Vladimir sent word that he was ready for the princess, Byzantium stalled. Months passed. Anna didn't arrive. Vladimir understood what was happening. The emperors had used him to win their war. Now they hoped he would forget the marriage agreement. Vladimir didn't forget. He assembled an army and sailed across the Black Sea to Cherson, a Byzantine city in Crimea. He besieged it. After months, the city fell, betrayed, according to the chronicles, by a priest who revealed the location of the water supply. Vladimir sent a message to Constantinople. "I have taken your city. Send the princess, or I will do to Constantinople what I did to Cherson." Basil sent Anna. She wept the entire journey, believing she was being sent into slavery among barbarians. When she arrived in Cherson, Vladimir was baptized. He took the Christian name Basil in honor of the emperor. Then he married Anna in a Christian ceremony. The deal was complete. Vladimir returned to Kiev in 988 with a Christian wife, Byzantine priests, and a new faith. What happened next was forced conversion on a scale Eastern Europe had never seen. Vladimir ordered the destruction of the pagan idols he had erected 8 years earlier. Perun, the thunder god with his silver head and gold mustache, was tied to a horse's tail, dragged through the streets of Kiev, beaten with sticks, and thrown into the Dnieper River. Men were stationed downstream to push the idol away if it drifted toward shore, ensuring it floated out of sight. The other gods were burned or smashed. Then came the mass baptism. Vladimir issued a decree. Every citizen of Kiev would be baptized in the Dnieper River. "If any man, rich or poor, does not betake himself to the river tomorrow, he will be my enemy." The chronicles describe hundreds, possibly thousands, of people wading into the water while Byzantine priests performed the rites. Parents held children. The elderly were carried. Whether they understood what was happening, whether they believed, didn't matter. This was law. Christianity spread from Kiev outward, following the same routes the Varangians had used to build the state. Novgorod resisted. Vladimir sent his uncle Dobrynya and a commander named Putyata with an army. The city was forced into submission. A saying emerged: Putyata baptized with the sword, Dobrynya with fire. But why Christianity? Vladimir had considered other options. Muslim Volga Bulgars sent envoys. Vladimir rejected Islam because it forbade alcohol. "Drinking is the joy of the Rus," he reportedly said. "We cannot exist without it." Jewish Khazar envoys came. Vladimir asked where their homeland was. "We have none," they admitted. "God scattered us for our sins." Vladimir rejected a faith whose God couldn't protect his people's land. Catholic envoys from Rome arrived, but Vladimir sent them away. Rome was too distant, too foreign, and the Pope's authority threatened the independence of any ruler who accepted it. Orthodox Christianity from Byzantium solved every problem. It tied Rus to the wealthiest, most powerful state in Europe. It brought literacy, law, and legitimacy. It didn't require a foreign authority. The church in Kiev would answer to Constantinople, but the Grand Prince controlled the church within his territory, and it came with a princess whose bloodline connected Vladimir to the imperial family. Vladimir had chosen civilization, but conversion by decree didn't mean conversion of the heart. In the countryside, pagan practices persisted for centuries. Priests complained that peasants still worshipped Perun in secret, still left offerings at sacred groves. The synthesis that defined Kievan Rus, Varangian, Slav, and now Christian, remained incomplete, contested, a work in progress. The hybrid civilization emerges. The decades after 988 saw Christianity spread across Kievan Rus, but the process was uneven, incomplete, and often superficial. In Kiev and the major trading cities along the Dnieper, churches rose. Byzantine architects arrived to build in stone, replacing wooden pagan temples with structures modeled on Constantinople's basilicas. Priests came from Byzantium and Bulgaria, bringing liturgical texts in Old Church Slavonic, a language close enough to the local Slavic dialects that it could be understood. Literacy spread among the elite. The sons of boyars, the warrior aristocracy, learned to read scripture alongside their training in warfare. But in the countryside, change came slowly. Peasants continued to leave offerings at sacred groves. They celebrated pagan festivals tied to the agricultural calendar, the summer solstice, the harvest, the winter darkness. When priests arrived to condemn these practices, villagers nodded, attended church on Sundays, and returned to the old rituals in private. The term for this was dvoeveri, dual faith. Christianity and paganism coexisted, blending into something neither Byzantine nor purely Slavic. The Varangian warrior class, the druzhina that had built the state, also transformed. New Varangian warriors continued to arrive from Scandinavia throughout the 10th and early 11th centuries, drawn by the promise of wealth and land. But now they arrived in a Christian state. They converted upon arrival, took Christian names, and married into Slavic families. Within a generation, their children spoke Slavic as their first language. Old Norse became a secondary tongue, used among the retinue, but not in administration or trade. The names shifted. Helgi became Oleg, Ingvar became Igor, Gnvalder became Rogvolod, Waldemar became Vladimir. The Scandinavian roots were still visible, but the pronunciation, the spelling, the cultural context, all were Slavicized. By the mid-11th century, the distinction between Varangian and Rus had blurred to the point of meaninglessness. The Rus were no longer an ethnic group. They were the inhabitants of a state, regardless of whether their grandfathers had come from Scandinavia, Slavic tribes, or Finnic settlements. The language of power reflected this synthesis. Old East Slavic became the administrative language of Kiev and Rus, used in legal codes, chronicles, and treaties. But it carried Old Norse loanwords that revealed the Varangian origins of the state. Boyar, the term for the noble warrior class, likely derived from the Old Norse boyun, a term for an administrative official, came from the Old Norse thjon, meaning servant. Grid, meaning peace or truce, came from gridr. These words became so embedded in Slavic that their foreign origins were forgotten. The trade routes that had built the state continued to function, but the people moving along them were no longer Scandinavian raiders. They were Rus's merchants, men whose fathers might have been Varangian, but who now identified with Kiev, with the Dnieper, with the emerging Christian civilization that tied them to Byzantium. The longships that had once carried Norse warriors now carried goods blessed by Orthodox priests. This hybrid civilization, Varangian military organization, Slavic agricultural base, Byzantine Christianity, and Finnic knowledge of the northern forests, was something new. It wasn't Scandinavian, it wasn't purely Slavic, it was Rus's, and under Vladimir's son, it would reach its peak. Yaroslav the Wise, the Golden Age. 1019 AD. Another fratricidal war had ended. Vladimir's sons had turned on each other after his death in 1015, just as their fathers and uncles had before them. Sviatopolk, who would be remembered as the Accursed, had murdered 3 of his brothers, Boris, Gleb, and Sviatoslav, in a desperate bid to secure power. Yaroslav, ruling from Novgorod, marched south with an army of Varangians and Novgorodians. The armies met near Liubek on the Dnieper. Sviatopolk's forces broke. He fled west, dying somewhere in the wilderness between Rusas and Poland. Yaroslav became Grand Prince of Kiev. He was in his late 30s, battle-tested, and he had seen what endless succession wars did to the state. His father Vladimir had murdered his way to power. His brothers had done the same. The cycle had to end, or Kievan Rus' would tear itself apart. Yaroslav's reign from 1019 to 1054 became the high point of Kievan Rus. Not because he conquered new territories, he didn't. Not because he accumulated vast wealth. The trade routes his ancestors built did that. Yaroslav's achievement was creating the legal and cultural infrastructure that transformed Kievan Rus' from a tribute extraction operation into a civilization. His first act was codifying law. Before Yaroslav, justice in Rus' operated on the principle of blood revenge. If someone killed your kinsman, you killed theirs. If someone stole from you, you took from them. Feuds lasted generations. Entire families were wiped out over insults that no one could remember. This wasn't sustainable in a state trying to integrate Varangian warriors, Slavic peasants, Finnic traders, and Byzantine Christians. Yaroslav created the Ruskaya Pravda, Russian law, the first written legal code in East Slavic history. It replaced blood feuds with fines. Murder wasn't avenged with another murder, it was compensated with a payment to the victim's family. The amount varied based on the victim's status. Killing a member of the prince's retinue cost 40 grivnas. Killing a free peasant cost 5. Killing a slave cost far less. The system wasn't equal, but it was predictable. It created a framework where disputes could be settled without violence spiraling into clan warfare. The Ruskaya Pravda also regulated commerce. It set rules for debt collection, property disputes, and inheritance. It protected merchants traveling through Rus' territory and established penalties for theft, assault, and breach of contract. For the first time, there was a written standard that applied across Yaroslav's realm, from Novgorod to Kiev to the outlying principalities. Yaroslav built. In Kiev, he commissioned the Cathedral of St. Sophia, modeled on Hagia Sophia in Constantinople. It was a statement. Kiev was no longer a frontier outpost. It was a Christian capital worthy of comparison to Byzantium itself. The cathedral's mosaics and frescoes were created by Byzantine masters, but the structure incorporated elements of wooden Rus' architecture, multiple domes, steep roofs designed to shed snow. It was another synthesis, Byzantine ambition expressed through local materials and techniques. He promoted literacy. Monasteries became centers of learning. Monks copied manuscripts, translated Greek texts into Slavic, and began compiling the chronicles that would become the Primary Chronicle, the foundational historical text of Rus. Schools opened in Kiev and Novgorod, teaching the sons of boyars to read Church Slavonic and Greek. Literacy was no longer the exclusive domain of priests. It became a tool of governance. Yaroslav's diplomatic strategy tied Kievan Rus into the web of European royal families. He married his daughters to kings. Anna married Henry I of France and became Queen of France. After Henry's death, she served as regent, signing royal documents, Anna Regina. Anastasia married Andrew I of Hungary. Elizabeth married Harold Hardrada, who would later become King of Norway and die invading England at the Battle of Stamford Bridge in 1066. Yaroslav's sons married into Polish and Byzantine nobility. These weren't just marriages, they were alliances that recognized Kievan Rus as a major European power. But Yaroslav made one fatal mistake. He didn't fix the succession system. When he died in 1054, he divided his realm among his sons, assigning each a city based on seniority. The eldest, Izyaslav, took Kiev. The second, Sviatoslav, took Chernigov. The third, Vsevolod, took Pereyaslav. The system was called Rota, rotation. When the Grand Prince of Kiev died, everyone moved up. The Prince of Chernigov became Grand Prince. The Prince of Pereyaslav moved to Chernigov. Younger brothers moved into the vacated seats. In theory, this prevented the wars of succession that had plagued every generation since Rurik. In practice, it created constant conflict. Every death triggered a reshuffle. Every reshuffle created disputes over who was senior, who had been passed over, who deserved which city. Princes fought their uncles, their nephews, their brothers. The unity Yaroslav had built began to fracture the moment he died. The fragmentation begins. After Yaroslav's death in 1054, his sons honored his division of territory. For a time, the system worked. Izyaslav ruled Kiev. Sviatoslav governed Chernigov. Vsevolod held Pereyaslavl. The brothers coordinated defense against the Cumans. Turkic nomads, the Ruses called Polovtsi, who had replaced the Pechenegs as the dominant steppe power. They met in council to settle disputes. They maintained the trade routes. The state functioned, but the next generation shattered the peace. The problem was the rota system itself. It assumed every prince would accept his place in the hierarchy, that seniority would be respected, that brothers would wait their turn. But what happened when a prince died before becoming Grand Prince? Did his sons inherit his place in the rotation, or were they pushed aside by their uncles? The Russkaya Pravda had codified law for commoners, but it said nothing about princely succession. 1078 A. Izyaslav was killed in battle fighting his nephew. Vsevolod became Grand Prince of Kiev. When Vsevolod died in 1093, his son Vladimir Monomakh should have taken Kiev based on direct succession. But the rota system said the throne should pass to the senior surviving brother of Yaroslav's line, Sviatopolk II, son of Izyaslav. Vladimir stepped aside to avoid civil war. Sviatopolk ruled Kiev for 20 years, but his authority was constantly challenged by cousins who believed they had been cheated. Every princely death triggered a crisis. Cities changed hands, alliances shifted. Princes who ruled one city one year found themselves exiled the next, forced to fight their way back or accept a lesser territory. The system created a class of dispossessed princes, men with legitimate claims but no land, who hired Cuman mercenaries and launched raids against their relatives. 1097 AD, the princes met at Lübeck, hoping to end the chaos. They agreed to a new principle. Let each one hold his own. No more rotation. Each prince would keep his father's territory and pass it to his sons. Kiev would remain the seat of the Grand Prince, but the other principalities would become hereditary. It failed within a year. Princes ignored the agreement when it suited them. They invaded each other's territories, claiming old grievances or new insults. The Cumans exploited the disunity, raiding deep into Russ's lands, burning towns and taking slaves. The southern trade routes became dangerous. Merchants who once traveled freely from Kiev to Constantinople now risked ambush at every portage. The Cumans weren't like the Pechenegs. They were more organized, more numerous, and they had learned that divided Russ's princes could be played against each other. A prince losing a succession war would hire Cuman cavalry. His rival would do the same. The nomads raided both sides, took payment from both sides, and weakened Kievan Russes with every campaign. Economic power began shifting north. Novgorod, protected by distance and forests, continued to prosper. Vladimir Suzdal, in the northeast, grew wealthy from trade with the Volga Bulgars and access to northern fur-trapping regions. Galicia-Volhynia in the southwest developed ties with Poland and Hungary. Kiev remained symbolically important, the mother of Rus's cities, but it no longer controlled the resources or the military strength it once had. By the early 13th century, Kievan Russes existed in name only. It was a collection of rival principalities, each ruled by a branch of the Rurikid dynasty, each claiming legitimacy from Yaroslav, each fighting the others for territory, tribute, and prestige. The unity that Oleg had forged in 882, that Vladimir had Christianized in 988, that Yaroslav had codified in the 1050s, it was gone. Then the Mongols arrived. The Mongol Cataclysm, 1223 AD. Mongol scouts appeared on the steppe east of the Dnieper. They weren't raiders. They were a reconnaissance force, probing the edges of a world they intended to conquer. The Cumans, who had terrorized Rus for decades, fled west in panic. Their Khan Kurtan sent desperate messages to his son-in-law, Prince Mstislav of Galicia. Today the Mongols have taken our land. Tomorrow they will take yours. The Rus princes met in council. For once they agreed. A coalition army assembled, soldiers from Kiev, Galicia, Chernigov, Smolensk, Volhynia. Mstislav, the Bold of Galicia, commanded. They marched east to meet the Mongol force at the Kalka River, near the Sea of Azov. The battle was a catastrophe. The Rus' princes couldn't coordinate. Some charged without waiting for others. The Cumans broke early and fled through Rus' lines, spreading chaos. The Mongols, disciplined, patient, tactically superior, encircled and destroyed the Rus' forces piecemeal. 6 princes died. Thousands of soldiers were slaughtered. The Mongols captured Mstislav of Kiev and 2 other princes, tied them under wooden boards, and crushed them slowly beneath the weight of a victory feast. Then the Mongols withdrew. They rode east, back across the steppe, and disappeared. The Rus princes, battered and humiliated, returned to their territories and resumed their feuds. They treated Kalka as a freak disaster, not a warning. They were wrong. 1237 AD, Mongols returned. This time it wasn't a scouting force, it was an army of conquest led by Batu Khan, grandson of Genghis Khan. They came in winter when the rivers froze solid, and Mongol cavalry could ride across ice that would stop any other army. They swept through the Volga-Bulgarian lands, annihilating resistance, then turned toward Rusas. Ryazan was first. The city's prince refused to surrender. The Mongols besieged it for 5 days, then stormed the walls. They killed everyone, men, women, children, priests. They burned the churches with people sheltering inside. Ryazan ceased to exist as a city. It would remain abandoned for decades. Then Vladimir, the capital of Vladimir Suzdal, the wealthiest principality in the northeast. The Mongols arrived in February 1238. Grand Prince Yuri had taken his army into the field, hoping to meet them in open battle. His sons stayed to defend the city. The siege lasted 4 days. The Mongols built siege engines, battered the walls, and poured through the breaches. The princes died fighting. The cathedral, where the royal family had taken refuge, was set on fire. Everyone inside burned. Yuri's army was caught at the Sit River in March. The Mongols surrounded and destroyed it. Yuri's head was brought to Batu Khan as a trophy. City after city fell. Suzdal, Rostov, Yaroslavl, Tver. Torshok held out for 2 weeks, longer than any other, but it fell in March 1238. The Mongols were 100 kilometers from Novgorod when they stopped. They turned south. Historians still debate why. Perhaps the spring thaw made the roads impassable. Perhaps Batu Khan wanted to secure the southern steppes before pushing farther north. Novgorod was spared, but the rest of northeastern Rus was devastated. 1240 AD, Mongols came for Kiev. The city had been weakened by decades of princely wars, its population reduced, its defenses neglected. Prince Michael fled before the Mongols arrived. His deputy Dmitro stayed to organize the defense. The Mongols surrounded the city in November and brought up siege engines. The walls of Kiev, which had stood for centuries, cracked under the bombardment. The Mongols stormed through. Dmitro was captured but spared. Batu Khan admired his courage. The rest of the city was sacked. The Cathedral of St. Sophia, built by Yaroslav the Wise, was looted. The Golden Gate, symbol of Kiev's greatness, was left standing in a field of ruins. Kievan Rus' as a unified state was finished. The Mongols didn't occupy the land. They established the Golden Horde, a khanate that ruled from Sarai on the lower Volga. Rus' princes had to travel to Sarai to receive yarliks, patents of authority, confirming their right to rule. They paid tribute. They provided soldiers when the Khan demanded. They survived by submission. The Tatar yoke would last 240 years. The legacy: 3 nations, 1 origin. The Mongol conquest ended Kievan Rus' as a unified state, but it didn't erase the memory. The lands that had once answered to Kiev fragmented into different political trajectories, each shaped by geography, by which overlord they served, by how they survived the centuries after 1240. In the northeast, the Principality of Moscow rose. It was a minor town during the Kievan period, barely mentioned in the chronicles. But Moscow's princes learned to collaborate with the Golden Horde. They collected tribute for the Khans, served as intermediaries, and slowly accumulated power. In 1380, Prince Dmitry Donskoy defeated a Mongol army at Kulikovo Field, the first major Rus' victory over the Tatars. A century later, in 1480, Ivan III stopped paying tribute. The Tatar yoke was over. Moscow claimed itself the heir to Kiev, the inheritor of the Rurikid legacy, the Third Rome, after Constantinople fell to the Ottomans in 1453. In the west and south, the story was different. The Grand Duchy of Lithuania expanded rapidly in the 14th century, absorbing the lands of modern-day Belarus and much of Ukraine. Lithuanian rulers were pagan at first, but they adopted Christianity, Catholic Christianity from Poland, and Orthodox from Byzantium. The Western Rus lands became part of a different world, tied to Central Europe rather than the Eurasian steppe. When Lithuania merged with Poland in 1569, these territories became the borderlands, the Ukraina, of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. These different paths created different identities. By the 16th century, the people living in Moscow, in Kiev, in Polotsk, no longer saw themselves as one nation. They spoke related languages, but those languages were diverging. They shared a common origin in Kievan Rus, but they interpreted that origin differently. Russia claimed direct continuity. Moscow's rulers called themselves Grand Princes, then Tsars, and insisted they were the legitimate successors to Vladimir and Yaroslav. They pointed to the fact that the Rurikid dynasty had continued unbroken in Moscow until 1598. They built their identity on the idea that they had preserved Orthodox Christianity and Rus' statehood, while the Western lands had fallen under Catholic Polish domination. Ukraine claimed the heartland. Kiev itself, the mother of Rus' cities, was in Ukrainian territory. The Dnieper trade route, the baptism of Vladimir, the golden age of Yaroslav, all of it happened on land that would become Ukraine. Ukrainian intellectuals in the 17th and 18th centuries argued that they, not Moscow, were the true heirs of Kievan Rus. Moscow was a latecomer, a frontier principality that had risen to power by serving Mongol overlords. Belarus claimed the legacy of Polotsk and the Western principalities. The Grand Duchy of Lithuania, which ruled Belarusian lands for centuries, saw itself as the successor state to Kievan Rus. Lithuanian Grand Dukes used the title Grand Duke of Lithuania and Rus. The legal code of the Grand Duchy was based on Rus' law. The official language was a form of Old East Slavic, not Lithuanian. All 3 claims have historical basis. All 3 are incomplete. Kievan Rus was the common ancestor, but the descendants diverged. They developed different languages, different political systems, different relationships with neighboring powers. By the time of the Russian Empire in the 19th century, the question of who truly inherited Kievan Rus had become a political weapon. used to justify territorial expansion, to claim cultural superiority, to deny the legitimacy of rival nationalisms. The truth is simpler and more complicated. Kievan Ruses was a hybrid civilization: Varangian warriors, Slavic farmers, Finnic traders, Byzantine Christians, that existed for roughly 350 years. It created a shared culture, a common faith, and a legal tradition that shaped Eastern Europe. Then it fractured. The pieces evolved separately. They became Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus, three nations with one origin, each claiming the inheritance, none possessing it entirely. The Northmen's blueprint. The Vikings, who sailed down the Dnieper in 862, came to trade. They became the founders of a civilization that defined Eastern Europe for centuries. They merged with Slavs, adopted Orthodox Christianity, and created a hybrid culture that was neither Scandinavian nor purely Slavic. It was Russia's. That synthesis shaped the languages, the laws, the faiths, and the identities of three modern nations. If you want to understand Russia, Ukraine, and their conflict today, you must understand this origin story. Subscribe for more deep dives into the history that shapes our world.